Financial implications of confinement feeding pregnant ewes in a low rainfall environment by Lucy Anderton. What do you think the average wheatbelt farmer wants for Christmas? Well, rain by the 25th of April, a decile 5 season, and 800 kilograms of dry matter per hectare of food on offer by midwinter, just like their fathers did and their grandfathers. But these days, all too often, it's more like this. It's a dry start to the year with a late break, and a decile 3 year, and we are feeding sheep until midwinter. So April comes and goes, and May arrives, and the typical Eastern wheatbelt farmer has put their crop in dry, and they are praying for their sheep. They probably, more often than not, don't consider putting their ewes into confinement because it tends to be something that they do down south where it rains. But is it actually feasible for that Eastern wheatbelt and that low rainfall environment to put their ewes in confinement? It's take control of the situation and adapt to the new normal. As scientists, we love confinement feeding because it's good for the soil and environment, has great animal welfare outcomes when it's done properly. And for me personally, it was a really great economic challenge to have a look at. So I wanted to know if there was any economic motivation for farmers to put their ewes into confinement, especially during seeding. So I've modelled a typical wheatbelt farm, low rainfall. And what you need to know is that I've assumed a June lambing, although this is not typical for the area. But because I'm confinement feeding, I didn't want my ewes lambing in confinement. It's a June lambing. And what I've done is I've compared a decile 5 year to a decile 3 year without confinement to begin with, to give me a base scenario. A decile 3 year costs more than a decile 5 year to meet the energy demands of the flock, as you would expect. And that's $44 per head per mated ewe in a decile 3 year compared to the decile 5. So when you compare these results to with confinement feeding, you can see that there's a slight additional cost for confinement feeding in a decile 5 year. Again, you might expect this, but there is absolutely no difference in a decile 3 year with and without confinement, which means that it's actually a really good risk management strategy. But if there's no economic benefit, then why would you do it? Well, what if decile 3 heads south when you're not confinement, without confinement feeding is a strategy? And perhaps ewe mortality rates increase from 3% to 8%, lambing percentages decrease from 85% to 75%, and lamb growth rates change from 180 grams per head per day to 160. Well, the results start to really show a difference. Instead of the $141 per hectare, it becomes $115 per hectare, which actually equates in my model farm to something like $34,000 in difference. So that sort of becomes like a new kitchen or maybe a contribution towards a new ute. But as a typical wheatbelt farmer, I usually lamb in May. And my actual comparison should be May lambing without confinement versus June lambing with confinement. So, and remember, I did with and without confinement in June lambing. So let's have a look at that. Let's have a look at the difference. So confinement feeding June lambing, just to remind you, the gross margin dollars per hectare with confinement was $197 and $141. When you look at it in May lambing without confinement, it's actually decile 5 is 182, and the decile 3 without confinement in May lambing is $113. So those are the things that's what we actually really need to compare. And that $113 equates to nearly nearly $40,000. So you could argue that it becomes economically motivational to alter the time of lambing and confinement feed to manage risk, especially for the worst case scenario. So what do the figures tell us? Well, they actually tell us there is an economic benefit to confinement feeding in the low rainfall or late start to the year, even though it might be small. But we also know that those types of years are increasing in frequency and becoming the new normal. We also know that supplementary feed costs decreased with later lambing. And we're more likely to achieve higher lamb growth rates with confinement feeding and reduce the risk of lower sale weights. And there is a benefit to the environment and to animal welfare. But there are challenges, feeding sheep or seeding. That's difficult to convince farmers that they have to learn new skills and new management tactics, which is time consuming, and this more intensive management of sheep around seeding time. But the opportunities do exist, and the economic benefit might be small and may not be enough to consider. But the economic loss from not confinement feeding in a poor season is actually potentially much greater. Supplementary feeding costs do decrease with that later lambing and so increase the profitability of the enterprise. Audrey Bird, who I consulted throughout this analysis, introduced confinement feeding into her system last year. And she reported that it exceeded their expectations, mainly due to the huge growth in biomass, just from defer grazing those pastures. So we can go from this to taking control of the new normal with new tactics to manage risk and being proactive and making more informed decisions, which is perhaps the backstory to this analysis. I used a piece of software called myFARMSMART, which I've developed to do this analysis and which is available online, and you're welcome to go and have a look at. And you're more than welcome to contact me by any of these means to ask me more about this work. Thank you.